All right, everyone, welcome to the podcast. We have Dr. Rayyan Zafar with us. Hello, Ryan. How are you?
Hey, good. Good to see you and good to be here.
Dr. Rayyan Zafar, PhD, MRSB, is a neuropsychopharmacologist and UKRI postdoctoral fellow at Imperial College London's Center for Psychedelic Research. Working with Professor David Nutt, he studies brain mechanisms of addiction, mental health disorders, and how psychedelics can treat neurological and psychiatric conditions. Zafar is leading the world's first clinical and brain imaging study on psilocybin therapy for gambling addiction. He's also a senior researcher at Drug Science, a lead research partner at ITER Investments, and an advisor for companies in the psychedelic, cannabis, and wellness industries. Through media appearances and talks, Zafar shares his insights on drugs, mental health, and psychedelics, aiming to foster understanding. He was recently named one of the top 25 emerging leaders in the psychedelic space. Welcome, Dr. Rayyan Zafar, to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Amanda. And obviously, so good to see you after about a month of being back here in the UK.
How fast and slow the time goes. Yeah, I'm so happy to have you. I would love for you to tell our guests what I was just speaking upon, right? So, neuropsychopharmacology. That is
Mhm.
something that maybe most people would say, "Ooh, there's a lot going on in there," and drug research. So, tell me if you were just passing someone on the street and they said,
Mhm.
"What research and what do you do?" Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so neuropsychopharmacology is a mouthful, and it's got three words in it. Neurons is the first, neuro is the first word from neurons, which are the cells in the brain. Psycho comes from the psyche, which describes the mind or the soul, and pharmacology is looking at how drugs interact with the body. So neuropsychopharmacology is really a study of looking at how drugs interact with the brain and the mind and how they can change human behavior. So what my work really encapsulates is that kind of study, putting drugs, and some of them are psychedelic drugs, some of them are actually non-psychedelic drugs, and seeing how it can shift people's behaviors and brain patterns, and ultimately try to move them from a state of disorder or mental illness to a place of order and wellness, essentially.
Fantastic. That makes sense. Now, it's a fascinating world of combination that we're starting to see, and we'll get into this today with your experiences with psychedelics and something that I've been seeing over the past 10 years, which is how do we, as a community, and especially as a scientific community, begin to understand one, what does it mean to be mentally well, right? From a biological perspective in the brain, from a felt sense experience, from the psyche, which may be, the way that someone describes it. But I guess the first question that really came up with your description is what have you seen as far as psychedelic medicine versus, let's say, any other type of drug? The biggest question is how do you define, or how does your lab define a psychedelic? Because there's some argument on that, right, on certain drugs.
Starting with the definition, the old definition and the original definition was made in the 1950s by this British psychiatrist called Humphrey Osmond, and he twinned two words together. So the first is psyche, which describes the mind and the soul, and the second was delos, which is manifesting or making visible. So collectively, those two Greek words described mind manifesting or soul visible. But before that time, psychopharmacologists like myself used to call these class of drugs hallucinogenics, or they used to call them psychotomimetics. And psychotomimetic means that they mimic psychosis. And that was because it was trying to describe what the drugs do to an individual in terms of their thoughts and behaviors. But the word psychedelic in and of itself, in that terminology, is quite a broad term because what it really can entail is an experience of anything that manifests the mind or makes the soul visible. So if you think of like the etymology of the word then and what it actually kind of embodies, psychedelic drugs, like classic psychedelic drugs such as psilocybin, which is the active ingredient found in magic mushrooms, or a DMT, which is found in ayahuasca, and 5-MeO-DMT found in snore and toad, and mescaline, for example, we classify them as classic psychedelics. And they, all of those drugs embody this kind of mind manifestation or making the soul visible feeling, quite remarkably. And that's a classification of like psychedelic drugs, the classic psychedelics. And we call them classic psychedelics because they all work on the same receptor in the brain called the serotonin 2A receptor. So what we're trying to develop and what my field are particularly looking at as neuropsychopharmacologists and clinical researchers is trying to categorize psychedelic drugs under their pharmacology. So do they interact with a certain brain system and how so? And then if we can cluster them around that, we can start trying to understand a bit better how they work in the mind and the brain. So in our field, I guess there's a bit of contention about what defines that. And I guess from the neuropsychopharmacologist perspective, this kind of biologically based definition is usually what we stick to. So the classic psychedelics, and then you have like ketamine, which some people call glutamatergic psychedelics because they work on the glutamate system in the brain, or they're also called non-classical psychedelics because they don't engage with the serotonin 2A receptor in the same way as psilocybin, LSD, and DMT do.
Fantastic. So it so the main difference in the classification is really the serotonin 2A receptor.
Yeah, exactly. That's sort of the, for like at least pharmacologists and psychopharmacologists, that's sort of how we've began to kind of cluster the different drugs.
Yes. And what about cannabis? How would you can classify that, or how maybe does currently the scientific community classify cannabis?
Yeah, well, cannabis works on a completely different kind of neurotransmitter system called the endocannabinoid system. So actually, we have 10 times as many receptors in the endocannabinoid system as the dopamine and serotonin systems combined. It's actually the most prevalent neurotransmitter neuromodulated system in the body. So actually, really important. But in terms of psychedelic effects, some people say that, if they smoke a lot of high THC based cannabis or potent cannabis, they get these similar psychedelic-like effects. I know some authors have written some books about the psychedelic potential of cannabis. So if you go back to that core definition of what describes a psychedelic mind manifesting, I guess if you have a mind manifesting experience under cannabis, then that is a psychedelic cannabis-induced experience. But pharmacologically, it wouldn't be categorized as a classic psychedelic. It'd be classified probably as an atypical psychedelic in certain doses because of it working on a different pharmacological system than the serotonin system, like the others do.
That's fascinating. And just the cannabinoid system, that we have these receptors that we have evolved to have a system that is taking in those. And the same thing with nicotine, right? And same thing with certain things where like, oh, our brain, it has a desire and has evolved to have these receptors
Hmm.
to take these things in. It's just fascinating.
Yeah, we are our own, I like the phrase, we are our own pharmacy. We have all of the stuff inside us needed to reach the states that we desire.
Now, real quick, because this is just like fascinating to me on the history. So, when these were thought of as drugs that induce psychosis, and in many cases, I've worked with ayahuasca for about 3 years, not as a medicine person, but as a helper and an assistant, a facilitator. And there were some moments that I believe if there was a psychiatrist or a psychologist present, would have seen someone go into a state of psychosis, what might be classically mentioned as psychosis. And there is a danger for that, especially with ayahuasca and DMT. So, has that, I guess the question I'm really reaching for here is how has that understanding and even definition of psychosis evolved over the last century? And what do we consider, like, do we consider psychedelics inducing short-term psychosis? And what would that look like as far as safety or danger?
Really, really interesting. I've actually never been asked this before, and I was reading up about this literally this week, and it depends on the cultural lens. So, in some instances, I guess the actual effects of psychedelics could be put in a bracket of psychotic-like because you have these hallucinations, you have these profound shifts in your conscious sort of state, and it can, in some instances, lead to delusions, although the risk is very, very low. I have to say that when we do research in clinically controlled settings, at least the incidence of psychosis is relatively low because often we don't have people with a history of psychotic or schizophrenic-like disorders coming into trials. But I guess in settings where you primarily do your work, you don't always maybe know, or people might not fully disclose their background history, they might not know as well. And so it's interesting because on one hand, you can call them spiritual awakenings, right? On the other hand, some people might call them spiritual emergencies, and others can call it enlightenment. It really is, in my opinion, a psychosis when it's non-functional to an individual's long-term well-being and mental well-being. So people can often have really profound shifts in their spiritual alignment, or they might make change their perceptions of the world. And that's happened a bit with me, I guess, since my experience. And but it's not been maladaptive to a point that I can't function in the world and do my responsibilities and maintain my work and social and health relationships and interpersonal relationships. It becomes a psychosis, I think, when the delusions become maladaptive to the individual's health. So that's when I think it starts being defined under that. It's when they can't come down from that state and it becomes perhaps irrational, and doesn't serve a healthy function for them.
This is a fascinating, I don't want to go too deep on this, but this is a really fascinating conversation because from what I'm understanding, there isn't necessarily a biological definition of psychosis, right? Where it's like the brain is in XYZ, and so therefore this person, because culturally, this is an anecdotal story, and I don't know the origin of this, but there's a story that goes around psychedelic circles that there was an indigenous medicine man who hadn't left his area and his tribe much in his entire life, and he went into a psych ward and was just crying and crying because he said, "These are your shamans. These are your leaders. These are the people that are communicating with the spirit world." And to the Western world, they're like, "No, these people are psychotic. These people are not functioning in society, right? They're maladapted. They're unwell." And he spent time with them and said they just haven't been trained to be as connected as all of the channels, schizophrenia or listening, hearing voices. So from his lens, those were the most talented people, or those were the most gifted people, but they had just not been in a society that wasn't trying to just immediately medicate and immediately take those, in his view, again, those powers away. So it's a really fascinating conversation because when we say, okay, you have to be adapted to society, right? You have to pay your bills and go to work and do all these things. Like that's a lens. Whereas if
Mm,
you were in a
yeah.
different community and you started hearing voices very young, perhaps they would take you aside and say, okay, now we're going to train you to be the connector of worlds, or speaking to the spirits, right? So it's really fascinating.
So fascinating. Yeah. There's a whole field called cultural psychiatry, which really looks into it. And I know researchers that really go into looking at how mental illness is manifested differently in different cultures. So in the Western world, there's this kind of lens of psychosis, but you're right, in places such as like South America or Africa or South Asia, East Asia, these supernatural experiences or may be actually adaptive for communities. And I feel as though it always comes back to function, right? So if because if those behaviors are practical and allow you to function as an adaptive human in your ecological niche, then it's not a disorder. So it's like work addiction or being an athlete, for example. Athletes are essentially exercise addicts, but it serves an adaptive function in the society in which we live because they win medals and they contribute to society and everyone accepts it and is put on a pedestal. But ultimately, it is an obsessive, ritualistic thought, which has, for some athletes led to decline in their function and their ability, some high-performing athletes neglect their families, sometimes neglect their health, neglect their responsibilities, don't, you know, eat or nourish their bodies in certain ways, whatever it might be, is pushing themselves to extreme limits, but it's celebrated. So I always think you've got to come back to function whenever we think about any mental disorder or putting anyone in a box. It's questioning whether or not the so-called change in their normative behavior is adaptive or maladaptive. I think that's the way we should frame it, I think.
And it changes over time, right? This is the last thing I'll say on this because I really want to get into psilocybin and your
Yeah,
journey.
sure, yeah.
We've even seen, let's say, for example, with ballet and gymnastics, right? Like the evolution of gymnastics from kind of like that pre-Soviet, pre-Russian era was like, teen girls who just had kind of normal bodies and they were doing, wonderful things, but nothing crazy. And then when it started to become, no, we're going to train these girls so difficult that they never even go through puberty, right? And they're staying tiny and they're doing unbelievable feats and they're again punishing their bodies and changing their bodies in a way where we go, oh, this is celebrated and you get a medal and you get these things and it's and the shifts that are happening with that it is really it's really fascinating to see. So yeah, glad we had to drop in on that. So when you came to the retreat, as a little bit of a background, you reached out to us a few months prior and you were on a little bit of a journey through Mexico, visiting different places and different things, and wanted to come and experience a few days with the Buena Vida. And walk us through that. What were you doing in Mexico? How did your either your work or your interest lead you there? And what led you to a desire to have perhaps like what we like to frame our work as a ceremonial experience with psilocybin mushrooms?
Yeah, so I guess around 2 years ago was the first time I came to Mexico, and I'd always been fascinated by the country. Um, I'd never been, and it was the home of psilocybin mushrooms, sort of being offered to the Western world through individuals like Maria Spina. And so I kind of originally 2 years ago was drawn to the region to really kind of explore some of the cultural roots and the indigenous roots that this specific medicine, psilocybin that I'd been researching had the most kind of sort of folklore around. And so I came and visited, and I was also very much coming as well to kind of explore the dance music scene, which I love. And I'm also, yeah, I love music and electronic music. And so I came to like the eastern coast to Tulum originally, which I believe is where you also were based for some time.
Yeah,
And
home ground in Mexico for sure.
and that was great. And I had a really amazing time visiting like the Mayan sort of areas and visiting some shamans that were around there and experiencing kind of Mexican culture. And I had my first kind of ceremonial psychedelic experience then. And it was with one of my best friends. And the experience at the time I noted as being the most profound experience that I'd had in terms of changing my psyche. And but I really felt as though there wasn't a completion of the whole experience. And I'd been studying psychedelic medicine for about 4 years at that point, and the kind of experiences that the patients had did not really reflect with my experience. I thought maybe I hadn't fully unlocked the potential of the medicine in myself. Maybe I was scared, or maybe it just wasn't the right set and setting. I don't know. It just felt like my journey into doing it and experiencing the full breadth of a psychedelic experience wasn't yet complete. And so when reaching out to you, and I had this trip planned to Mexico again with some friends that I'd met 2 years ago out there, I thought I really want to be able to take part in something as a scientist and have first-hand experience of number one, a ceremonial setting, secondly, a group setting, because it's something I'd never done before. And I guess thirdly, I really wanted to allow the medicine to really come through me in a way that I don't think I'd been able to in kind of clinical hospital settings, and really to understand the importance of set and setting. And And that is really why I reached out, I guess, through Rosalind McAlpine, who's one of your kind of crew and a good friend of mine. And yeah, she recommended you, and yeah, I reached out, wasn't expecting an email back, and then yeah, it was so grateful for you to reach out back and say that you were willing to have me come over. And so I was actually in Mexico at the time, and I didn't actually know whether or not we'd be able to like sort the dates or go through. And then I was like, right, I'm gonna book my flights right now and come over to Puerto Vallarta and Sayulita, and it's Nayarit, right? Is that the area that we?
Yeah, so Puerto Vallarta is Jalisco, and then it's right on the border of Nayarit, so it's like two states that you're basically in at the. But yeah, so we're in Nayarit officially since we're north of Puerto Vallarta.
Yeah, so then yeah, that was essentially my motivation. I wanted to come into it open-minded. I wanted to understand how you and your team had brought together these experiences because I think there is a lot to learn between bridging the worlds of ceremonial practice and clinical Western medicine that we just haven't really uncovered. And for my own work, I wanted to at least give myself the opportunity to really appreciate the full breadth of psychedelic work.
Mm. I'm so, and that was one of the reasons I immediately felt that this was a good idea. Was that desire I could see in you. It was like there are these worlds, again, looking through different lenses, right? The lens of perhaps, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the lens of modern science is generally that of materialism and reductionism, right? There isn't necessarily like a belief or even a lot of room for the spirit world, right? Or the beyond material world. And it's really fascinating when even, just in the last 20 years, when we're starting to get these results from scientific studies like out of John Hopkins, mystical experiences and like things that there isn't that generally like science doesn't necessarily have a word for that we're trying to categorize and describe. And so coming in, when you came into our group, I asked you to, I believe we had, it was seven of us. There was like seven of us at this retreat. And the
Mhm.
first day during our orientation, I asked you if you would give us just like a 2 to 3 minute overview of what does psilocybin do in the brain? What is the actual experience? And you gave the most beautiful, concise, and incredible, just the scientific definition of like, okay, we're taking psilocybin, what is going on? And I would love for you to do that again on the spot.
So yes, if I recall rightly. So I as soon as you take magic mushrooms, so magic mushrooms, 185 different species, and no matter what kind of magic mushroom you take, provided they are magic mushrooms, they will be metabolized in the body to psilocybin first and then psilocin. And psilocin is a breakdown product and it's the active bioactive ingredient in the magic mushroom. And what that does is it enters into the bloodstream once it's been digested in the gut. And when it's in the bloodstream, it will enter up to the brain and it will cross through the brain through something called the blood-brain barrier. And it's because psilocin is small enough that it can actually permeate the capillary bed and actually go into the brain tissue. Now, once it's in the brain tissue, what psilocin binds to is something called the serotonin 2A receptor. Serotonin 2A receptor, as I said before, we now know is the primary docking station for classic psychedelics such as LSD, DMT, psilocybin, and mescaline. And what research has shown is that the greater the degree of binding of psilocybin to this serotonin 2A receptor, so the greater the affinity it has, the greater the trip. So if you bind it with 20% affinity, so about 20% of the receptors lock on, you have about a 4 out of 10 trip experience. But with 80% of the serotonin 2A receptors bound in your brain, you have a 10 out of 10 trip experience. So research has found a pharmacological target for this in the brain and found that if you block it with another drug called ketanserin, which stops psilocin from binding to the receptor, you don't trip. So this neurobiological lock and key, the serotonin 2A receptor, really are essentially what Aldous Huxley called the doors to perception, potentially, because you put the lock in, which is the psilocin. Oh no, the serotonin 2A receptor is the lock, and the psilocin is the key. And once they bind, they unlock. And at the unlocking stage is where it gets fascinating. So once they bind to those receptors, the serotonin 2A receptors are most predominantly expressed in the most evolved part of the human cortex. It's what differentiates us from our near ancestors, near hominid ancestors like chimpanzees and the great apes. It is in a part of our brain just over here in front of our forehead called the neocortex, and it covers a little bit of the back of the brain as well. And these receptors are most predominantly expressed in these evolved tissues. And what we think they're important for is for things like not just how to make a fire, but also questioning ourselves as to what could a fire do for the future of me and my survival and organisms like me. So it's really this 2A receptor which may have separated Neanderthals from Homo sapiens, and these receptor systems that allow for insight, allows for understanding of oneself, allows for the control of higher order cognitive abilities. And so in normal everyday, day-to-day lives, this higher order cognitive system, which is governed by having these serotonin 2A receptors in a certain conformation, allow for a part of our brain called the default mode network to exist. And this default mode is basically, by definition, default. When you're resting and not thinking about anything, it kind of hangs out there and it just keeps all your brain networks nice and ticking over to allow you to have a sense of self. So you're like, I'm Amanda, this is who I am, this is where I am, this is what I'm doing, and I'm Rayyan, this is what I'm doing. We're having a podcast, having a chat now. I'm grounded in that. When the serotonin 2A receptor is activated, it causes a disruption of that network. That network that is holding all your different brain networks together, so the default mode, the executive network, which is your thinking network, your memory network, which is self-explanatory, and also your reward networks, they all go disintegrate. There is a collapse of what we call the brain's hierarchical kind of control. And the collapse of the brain hierarchy from activating the serotonin 2A receptor leads to the brain becoming more random. And that randomness we call entropy. So there is an increase in entropy and an increase in randomness in the human brain after taking psilocybin. And this entropy is reflected by an increase in connectivity between parts of the brain's networks that would never usually communicate with each other under normal circumstances. And that's because the default mode network has broken down. It means that, for example, you might be able to taste sounds, and that is because your kind of sensors in your brain that are responsible for taste might be linking to your auditory cortex, or you might be able to see music, for example, and that's because your kind of, yeah, your auditory cortex and your visual cortex are more connected. And that explains why you trip, okay, with the visuals. And but also when you close your eyes, what that can do on a deeper psychological level is it can, we think, actually stop the ability for the brain to be stuck in rigid negative thought habits and thought patterns that might actually underlie conditions like depression. So in depression, you might think, I'm useless, I'm worthless, nothing good is going for me in my life. And that might be your internal monologue. And the default mode network we know has been hyperactive in people with depression. So by shutting that down with psilocybin, it allows the brain and the mind for the first time, maybe, for that person to be free of those thoughts. They may even, through the facilitation of these new networks, think differently about themselves. They might actually, because of these neural adaptations, think, maybe I'm not a bad person. Maybe I'm not useless. And we think that these neurobiological changes in brain patterns, the silencing of the default mode, the reconnecting of parts of the mind and the brain that have actually been hidden from each other or because of the disorder or because of the trauma in their lives, they become reconnected. It makes them face themselves. It makes them allow for new ways of thinking about themselves. It allows for the catalysis of new ways of being in the future. And what that stimulates as well is this window of plasticity that stays open now, we think, for some time, maybe 1 month after a psilocybin session. this change in the network seems to persist in patients that do well. And that is called neuroplasticity, the ability to change, to adapt, to move, to grow, and to move out of illness, out of maladaptive thought patterns into those adaptive ones, which we spoke about. I know I've probably gone over 3 minutes there, but
No, I could listen to this all day. I'm sure people are
uh,
so fascinated.
yeah,
And
it's
what
about breaking free. Yeah.
go ahead. Yeah.
No, I was going to say, yeah, like kind of summarizing it, we think the brain mechanism now is basically heating up this brain that's stuck in these rigid kind of networks, allowing a break free and allowing the brain to resettle into new neural modes of being, which allow for the facilitation of adaptive ways of behavior that you haven't previously had.
So much freedom. I mean, so much exploration. And I mean, it's so fascinating to be at a point where we're starting to see, having worked with many, many people with depression, anxiety being the core, I think, of a lot of the people I work with. Especially with depression, right? The idea that there would be any hope, that there would be any possibility for change. I think that when you have suffered from chronic depression for so long and so many other things have not worked, it's really difficult to even imagine a hope. And, hearing this from a biological standpoint, like what is actually happening in your brain, to me personally, it takes away a lot of the shame as well of like, I should be able to think differently, right? I should just be able to go for a walk in the sun and think that I'm a good person and think this and think that. And you're just like, and especially we're starting to see this, right? There's not as much, I don't think, research at this point, but we're starting to see how traumatic events and, even like CPTSD, which is like kind of chronic traumatic or low level traumatic events through childhood start to engineer the brain into these patterns. And so just trying to consciously think differently about yourself or journal about yourself or do this cognitive work. This is why I believe it can take so many years from like a cognitive behavioral perspective if we don't have that biological change in the brain that actually gives you the ability, perhaps the next day or within a month, to say, okay, the slate has been cleaned a little bit. What are the new ways that I want to think about myself, believe about myself, which then becomes my personal reality. It becomes my whole personality, what I really think of who I am, right?
Mm.
So speaking of that, so now we have that perspective, right? And we're going in and this is the morning of our journey. We'll put everyone in a picture of this retreat. We're in a beautiful setting in the middle of the jungle overlooking the ocean. We're going to have our journey outdoors as the sun goes down. And so you have sat with many people, you have seen the clinical results, you have such a powerful understanding of the mechanisms of action as what is about to happen to your brain and to your body. And so what I would like to do now is for you to describe, since this was, your first, let's say, ceremony with psilocybin in a group, right? So quite a different set and setting, like a different mindset, a different actual physical setting than you had experienced psilocybin before. But tell us about that night. Tell us about from when you're getting ready, like kind of what was going through your brain. I want to mention, because I think this is fascinating, you informed us as the leadership team. You said, I have this tendency to get a little bit in my head and start to intellectualize the journey as it's happening, which we very much encourage people as much as possible to not intellectualize as it's happening. There will be plenty of that the next day and the coming days. Um, because psilocybin, again, it can put you in that state of entropy or chaos, and to allow that to be and not try to put in so much order. But you mentioned to us, you're like, but I have a habit of doing that. So if I do that, if I begin to intellectualize or try to put things into boxes and figure it all out, just tell me to, continue my journey. And that perhaps maybe was a part of your journey. So yeah, talk us through that day as you're going into ceremony, and then just go right into what that experience was like for you.
Wow. Well, I'll start by saying that every time I think about going back to explaining it, and I've done it to a few friends, I get this like kind of full body feeling because it was one of the most profound experiences I've ever had in my life. And it was in the evening, yeah, we were in the villa, and we were told to come up about 6 p.m., 6:30 p.m. And the sun was beginning to set, and it was incredible. I mean, the setting is just unparalleled. Like the birds were beginning to chirp a little bit, and we had the altar there, and I bought this bracelet to the altar, which kind of reminded me of different parts of my life. I'd brought it out with me, and I'd worn it to at various points in my life, and it just like had this kind of symbolic meaning of just being there and on me, and it kind of symbolized my creative side, my fun side, and my explorative side, and I wanted to bring that explorative side to this because really it was probably the biggest exploration I would probably be going on. I didn't actually know that before I began. So yeah, uh um I asked you all to give me potentially a high dose because previously I'd done, 6 grams of mushrooms in my first trip, and so I disclosed that, and then part of your procedure is to not tell, and I love that because that is very down the cognitive and trying to figure out all the processes. I just love the unknown. And I sat down and you said something to me which was so literally to this day stands out so clearly. You said to me that if you're not sure whether the medicine is medicine, to ask it, show me the medicine. And that is probably in all 6 years of learning about prep work, the single most clear and just fundamental piece of advice I've ever heard. So it's just like, because sometimes you just don't know, right? And you don't know. And then the second piece of advice in the warm-up period was if you don't have a clear intention, then just say, just say to the medicine, show me what I need to be shown, or I'm open to it. So I came into it wanting to work a bit through previous experiences of mine as a young, well, I was really a child. I was like 12 at the time where I experienced an eating disorder called anorexia. I wanted to really kind of go into that maybe a little bit, and also kind of my work-life balance and really kind of just settling or understanding what my pace of life should be. Because that's something I've never really been amazing with is kind of I've always been going at things 100 miles an hour in my life, and that's caused me a good deal of success for sure, but also a good deal of pain and probably neglected, you know, aspects of my life because of that. And that was definitely something that I wanted to understand more about and get more in touch with. So I basically, yeah, we took the drink and that was sort of when it began. And the first, I'd say 30, 40 minutes, I was seeing lots of visuals and it was really kind of interesting. I was getting into it, and it's the same kind of people that I see every time I do mushrooms. It's like these avatar-like creatures, and they're kind of all swaying, and it's all kind of fun, but it's not really anything deep or psychological, but it felt familiar. And I was like, oh, hey, friends, like we've met before. And then I realized that, this isn't where I need to be. I need to kind of go a bit deeper. So I started to kind of ask that, and then I started realizing my body was shaking. Like parts of my body were like beginning to vibrate a lot. And I would say maybe you have a better idea of how long the time was, but I think it felt like about an hour or 2 hours. And I felt different parts of my body basically shaking quite violently, I felt at times. Like my back was like arching up and going down, like my hips were moving on their own accord, like my eyes were kind of rolling. It was a lot. It was probably the biggest like physical response I've ever had to anything. I almost describe it as potentially like a full body seizure. Like it felt like my whole body was entropy, not just my brain. It was like a whole body just energetically expressed. And as the vibrations moved through my body, it felt as though when it stopped in a certain place, it had healed that part of my tissue. it was almost like regenerative surgery was occurring at a cellular level through this vibration. And the phrase "the body keeps a score" has kept coming up in my integration. And it felt as though the shaking and the vibration was this kind of eliminating or purging of perhaps years of just running too fast, perhaps the abuse that I did to my body and my eating disorder, perhaps, general abuse that I've done to my body just through living life at 100 miles an hour in my 20s and work and socializing and not resting and all the things that you're told to do and you just neglect because you just think you can push through. No, no, no. My body was like, you're in a body, you're not just a brain. You're a whole organism and you need to respect every part of your organ and your the vessel that you're in. Um, and that felt so real to me. It felt even now, a month after, or just over a month after that experience, my body literally feels reconnected to itself. Like my body and my brain and my mind feel one, like complete physiologically. It feels as though like the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system have come together or rejoined for the first time. That's like a really lived thing. I feel sensations in my body in response to the environment, which I only used to feel in my head. Like if something good happens, like I used to get maybe like serotonin head rush, and I'm quite good at like putting emotions into neurotransmitters just because of my role in my job. Like but like I felt it in my body for the first time, the role of these neurotransmitter systems, not just in my brain. So that and still to this day is fascinating. And I'm just guided like more by my bodily feels and my brain. And like when I want to make a decision, I'm like checking in on myself about whether I want to, like, if I want to stay out with, like, in an evening, if I'm feeling tired, I'm like checking in. Am I tired? Am I up for staying, with friends for a little bit longer? Let's check in on that and make that decision. So I really feel like that's been an amazing one of the most powerful takeaways was that the body reconnection bit of it.
And so with that, this is absolutely fascinating because something almost a joke that we have in orientation. After no matter what we say in orientation, people somehow believe, obviously, because biologically, this is happening to the brain, but we have to remind them like this is happening to your whole body. And then we do a little version of mushrooms are physical, physical. The mushrooms are physical because it's the top thing that we have to remind people throughout the retreat. They're like, no, 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 it wasn't really giving me ideas or it wasn't showing me anything. It just kept vibrating my hips or it kept doing this to my heart or it was like these little entities were entering my body and fixing my cellular physical
Mm,
structure, which, culturally we might attribute to ayahuasca or we might attribute to other classic psychedelics, right, where it's physically healing you. But this is a symptom, I think, not only societally, but of this idea that we're like a brain, a body, and maybe a spirit, right? And they're all kind of connected through like maybe a little wire here and there, but that our mind and our body is not just really one system. And so
mm,
I love that you're describing and also if we can take a moment here to really acknowledge what I believe is probably the most so I want to say this like from my experience working with a lot of different areas of mental health and really recently the past few years quite a few people with eating disorders and myself I have never been officially diagnosed but have been struggling with my body and weight and just disordered relationship with food and body throughout my whole life. And it's really fascinating in this kind of the woo-woo spiritual world when they say, oh, you need to get into your body and you need to I'm like for years I was like what are you I'm like I am in my body I like here's my hands here's my feet like what are you taught how could I not be in my body but yet
yeah.
like you were saying when you experience everything through the mind what you think about everything as opposed to like you were saying like should I go home right now with my friends like should I sleep for tomorrow right based on all of the data from my brain or like asking the body like reconnecting in that way And I guess I just love to know a little bit more about, being a child, like, and now that you've grown older and had more insights into perhaps like, the necessity or the reason that that eating disorder came about at that time to maybe disconnect you from your body a bit, right? That maybe being in your body, for a lot of us, it wasn't safe to fully be in our expression of our full senses of our body.
Yeah, I mean, I know for a fact that when I was, in the heights of my eating disorder, you had to I consciously at the start suppressed hunger and appetitive sort of like reward drives because I was trying to restrict my eating. And in order to restrict eating, you really have to have this like mind over body and brain over body kind of like you get these like bottom up, I'm hungry, you've not eaten anything today, and then my brain being, no, we're not doing this. And that was a disorder. That is anorexia for you. You're in this battle between the body and the mind and the brain, and rejecting that very, very important, biologically essential drive for survival, which is eating. Overcoming that was psychologically and mentally clearly did some damage. And and I think what has happened, although I was very lucky enough to overcome my eating disorder, you know, after it took some time, but it doesn't affect me as really anymore. So, but maybe my behaviors have shifted into kind of other kind of brain over body, like just kind of go for it mentality. And I really, really for the first time don't feel it doesn't feel like I'm in the same body, brain or mind, but I really like this new interconnected space where I'm able to not just cognitively or psychologically be guided to make decisions. And I think that is where I've sat for 2 decades and perhaps catalyzed by the anorexia. Anorexia, I guess, is like it's good at giving you order and structure. And perhaps that's why I became a scientist, because I could then, use those skills and transfer that really kind of ordered and, we've got to do things like this and this and this and this. And that's useful, I guess, in becoming a scientist and writing papers. And that's kind of a cool skill. And uh, yeah, it's I guess it's really fascinating now to kind of come back into my body and really start just feeling out. I just decide what I want to do now. It really it doesn't feel like such a cognitive battle. It's like, am I up for it? Let's check in. Okay, maybe yeah, maybe no. And I'm just guided by that. Really, it's completely surprised me. It's taken me by shock that this could be an outcome.
Just awakening an entirely new way of it's funny because I feel like anecdotally we say that to a lot of guests, right? That there are different ways and languages of interpreting the world, and most of us in the Western world have been trained that our intellect is like 99% of the time, right? Unless you push your body to the very extent, and then it's like help, right? With disease or with pain or something, and then we maybe listen, and maybe even then we don't. But
Mm.
we're just so used to only having really a cognitive, intellectual way of interpreting, processing, and then like moving about the world. And psychedelics, as we've seen, like it's a very mysterious way that people start learning, these different languages, like languages of movement or intuition, where before they're like, I don't even, but all of a sudden I'm having these like rumblings right in my body, or I'm hearing something that's saying like no or yes, or like moving me toward and away. So it's really taking us back to, how do we begin to learn these new languages of interpreting the world and then behavior, that our behavior, if someone says, well, what is the reason that you're doing this? You're like, well, there's not really a reason, there's not a logical, I can't take you step by step through the reason. It's just an awareness, or it's something in my body. So going back to your journey, so this is happening. And I think, I just want to point this out, like from our perspective as leaders, occasionally people will be going through an experience which the next day they're like, oh my gosh, I was shaking the whole night. Did you see me? And from our perspective, we're like, no, you actually were very still. But for you, we did notice that. Like it was, again, it was completely safe and you were in your space, but like we noticed and could feel, I was like, there's a lot of energy moving there. There's a lot of like actual physical energy. there just felt like there was a lot happening. It's kind of a thing, again, something I can't perfectly describe in language, but I can just sense when certain people are just going through something that is like containing a lot of energy. And
Mm.
so tell us about the rest of your journey. Did it shift at all? Did I know that
Yeah.
there's kind of like some, as we see with psychedelics, right? There's kind of these different time periods or these different like sections of our journey.
Yeah. So after kind of the body bit had done, I mean, there were times where I was like kind of really freaking out, and it was like a lot for me to go through. Um, there was a time where it went from that kind of body bit to this psychological bit. So once the body had kind of been restored, it kind of shifted to the brain, and it was like, what are we going to do in here now to kind of sort what's in the head? And I met my granddad, who I've never met before, and he was my dad's dad, and he just appeared and just kind of like I asked him, do you know what I'm doing here? Like, as in this moment and in my life. And he was like, yeah, I'm very proud of you and, keep going and keep. And I was like, is there anything you want me to say to like my dad or my grandma? It's like, tell them I love them and that I'm waiting here for them. And I was like, wow. And then like, just like, as soon as he came and kind of like, it wasn't long that interaction, but it just felt really meaningful. And so like the experience was blessed and that it was fine to proceed. There was then there was this kind of a shift to this whole period of trying to figure out the meaning of life and the meaning of existence and reality. Because it was like, and this was maybe my cognitive side coming on and thinking, why are we here? Because I guess that's always been a core interest of mine. I think ever since I became mentally unwell with my eating disorder, I was really interested in the mind and the brain. And it really made me just think like the experience that we live in is so complex and mental disorders are so complex. And the brain can hold all of these different states, but for what purpose? Like, why am I here? What am I here to do? What am I here to achieve, if anything? And so the point of the next bit was really hard to put into words, but I saw the unraveling of time at really a quantum physics level, in the sense that every second in the future, I could see like slightly before everyone else and time just unraveling. And I was really looking around to try to find the meaning of life. So there was this whole purpose of like, okay, it's going to be here somewhere. Is it in my hands? And I was looking at my hands and watching like my hands move and unfold. Is it in the sky? Is it on the horizon? Is it in the trees? Like, is it in me? It was just like a million questions. And it occurred to me that at any one time in the universe, given the fact that the time is just expanding at an infinite rate, that I would never really be able to understand the point of this all, and that it was a useless endeavor to really bother with. And so I was like, damn, I'm never going to find the answers. I'm never going to know it all. And it was just it was so clear to me that it would just be a useless life if I just spent all my time trying to find all the answers. But in a weird way, the sheer confusion and complexity of the world and my brain state in that moment made me realize, damn, this is almost too big to even try to scientifically investigate. Like the brain, the mind, the purpose of our cells, the universe, psychedelics, what their impact is. It's so meaty, and there's so much we don't know about all of this. And that kind of made me really kind of humbled to mm, the power of the medicine and maybe also the limitations of what I can achieve. But in a really nice way now, that's grounded me in my ability to know that I don't have to know everything, I don't have to have the answers and I don't need to be answerable to anything. I can just be and exist. Because what the medicine taught me, and there was this kind of moment with God as well, which was basically playing out this thing that I was the Messiah and I was there to, or like some kind of, I was there to give some kind of message to the rest of the world based on this trip. And the message was that the world would never be the same again, but I had the answers. But I was in a battle with this kind of higher power saying, I don't have the answers. Like, I can't be the one delivering that message. And maybe that's a metaphor for the expectations I put on myself professionally or whatever it might be. I'm still trying to figure that one out, that I should know the answers. But then I really came to a point in this agreement with this higher power that I won't have all the answers, but I'll at least try, and I can only try my best. When that agreement came in, then it was then we were good. Then the higher power kind of like was like, okay, you don't have to lead the world to the next state, and you don't need to go and profess your learnings, and you just all you need to do is be present. And so then when it really told me to be present and I kind of was freaking out at this point, and I remember going up to one of the guides there, I don't know if I can say her name, Annalie, and yeah, and I was like, "Oh, I think something bad's gonna happen to me. Like, am I gonna be okay? Like, please apologize and like send my love to my parents and tell tell David no, I'm sorry for doing this because I genuinely thought that I was dying and that everything would be different. And maybe and it's true, everything is now different. It really does feel different for me because what I learned from scientific point of view, at least, is maybe in my lifetime, I won't know all the answers about how these medicines work. And maybe that's okay. And maybe there is some things that aren't answerable by science. And I really saw the kind of depth of the emotional, intense experience of nature coexisting as magic. Like it felt spiritual, it felt like magic, and it felt unexplainable by any measure or tool that I'm aware of. And that allowed me to just be humbled to the existence of humans and really in awe of our mere humanity. The fact that I could even just breathe, be present, and feel love and feel connected to those that were in that ceremony with me. It was a feeling I've never had. And I remember it so strongly, just that interconnectedness and that it's okay. That just breathe and be present and life will figure itself out. It was just this calming reassurance of the interconnectedness of everything and that there is a path and I'm on this path and I'll figure things out and karmic sort of forces will play out. And if I do good and stay curious to my field, then it will keep giving me back things that I need with my true intention, which is to help others. So it was really, yeah, profound. And then I guess to finalize it all was the timing. So I thought it had been over 24 hours because I misheard you.
What a great dinner.
And so I was really convinced, even when we were eating afterwards, that the world would never be the same again. So it was only really in the day after that I was like, okay, we are going back to some level of normality. Like I'm going to get my plane. I've not missed my plane. I thought it had been, don't know, several years in that. So it was, oh yeah, as I said, one of the most profound, overwhelming experiences. And yeah, I'm still piecing it together, but I'm so grateful for you and everyone else who took part in that with me because it really did change a lot for me.
I can really feel that. I can just really, really feel what a drastic change. I guess the biggest change we can ever have, right, is perspective, like a complete change of perspective. And your like
Mhm.
you said, your perspective of science and time and your body. And I mean, like all of these, like given the gift. And I think this is why it feels like a death experience. And sometimes for some people, it feels very much like an actual death experience, is that, biologically we are dying and being reborn constantly, right? Our
Mm,
cells, like everything is dying and being reborn all the time, but we don't cognitively, we think, no, I'm born and then I do XYZ and then I die once.
mm,
We don't die once, right? Like we can, if we allow ourselves, we can die to perspectives and die to personalities and die to dreams and desires that maybe we had at one time in our life if we really look at it that way. And it can feel, I think, like you experienced in the psychedelic space, very frightening and very scary when it's like, wait, am I actually, am I dying? And it's like, well, what is that, right? What is that I am
yeah.
perspective? I mean, going back to the original conversation, like that could be ultimately in the wrong situation, right? Without safety, psychosis, right? Where you completely disidentify, disembody, lose all sense of yourself. So
Mhm.
that's, I mean, what a beautiful unfolding journey that's going to be. And I really do love the way that you're looking at it. This is a perfect example of integration, right? That you're not taking literal. I think we've seen some people in this world do this, right? Like I'm taking literal that I'm the Messiah. I'm taking, oh, God spoke to me and now I'm the Messiah. So
Yeah,
I have this as a metaphor for what I believed that I was going to do as a scientist, right? That I was going to close the book on certain things, or I was going to like say this is, absolute fact. And
yeah.
as much as the methodology of science is obviously always to be like, let's be proven wrong, right? Like come up with a new theory. Sometimes it feels like almost like commercially or even academically, some of us can look at science as like, no, this is the answer, right? We figured it out. We figured out the this and we figured out the that. So thank you as a scientist for remaining open to the mystical, to the unfolding, to the I don't know, because that's going to can like really give you the ability to not get stuck in your ways and not get stuck in a certain, aspect of academia or a certain aspect of, where maybe something is taking you and really stay completely open. So I know that you have to get going pretty soon. We're gonna have to have a second episode because we
Yeah.
just opened up so many new portals. But if you have time, I have two
Yeah.
last questions for you. One that just came from what we were just speaking about, and then another that's more kind of on the current research. So first of all, just in speaking with your journey and with the retreat, if you had to answer me right now, just off the top of your head or your heart or your body,
Yeah.
what is psilocybin?
A teacher? I would say a teacher.
So does it have a consciousness? Like this is so tough, right? Is it a material? Like, is it a mushroom that's a biological compound, or does it have a consciousness? Which again, none of us can even define that word, but
Hmm. After my experience, I believe that somewhat consciousness transcends throughout a whole ecological system, somewhat. I'd probably best be versed by saying I don't know, because I don't know. And but I believe its ability to profoundly change consciousness and the mechanism through which it does that is not fully appreciated yet. So I'm open to me and others convincing me that it could or it couldn't. I'm just open. I don't know.
and just as you were speaking in the beginning of this conversation, right? Like what separates us from our near ancestors is this ability to go, not like I can make fire, but like what is the meaning of fire? What can it do? What does it mean for this meaning, right? So I mean, there are theories out there, right? That psilocybin played a huge role in that evolution between those two brain states. And what could it mean on a grand scale if more of us were able to consistently ingest psilocybin? Like what is the next piece, right?
Mm.
Let's to go from like function to
Mhm.
meaning to like, what is the next evolution of our brains and how we interact with this unknown consciousness with, you know,
Yeah.
this.
One absolutely fascinating piece of research that I read is that if you stimulate these serotonin 2A receptors with agonists in like a cell dish, it leads to the proliferation of the neocortex, so the growth of this highly evolved tissue. So you stimulate that receptor and the conscious tissue, the consciousness tissue of the brain grows. So what does that say?
The consciousness tissue of the brain, like what we see as, because as far as I know, and correct me if I'm wrong, in the greater scientific community, is there a definition or even acceptance of the fact of consciousness, like outside of material reality, or no?
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, by conscious tissue of the brain, what I mean by that is the most highly evolved part of the human cortex, the part that allows that insight, the part that allows us to create meaning, that neocortex of our existence. If you stimulate the 2A receptor with an agonist like psilocybin, it grows that tissue. So it grows more neocortex. So what does that say about the power of psilocybin? I don't know.
Wow, that's incredible. That's amazing. Okay,
Yeah.
last question.
Yeah.
As much time as you have, and I know you need to get going soon, so just as much time as you have, let us know right now in your lab, what are you researching? Obviously, you said you research a lot about addiction. What are you guys finding? And what's the next, 5 to 10 years of inquiry that's really like the funded inquiry that we're going to see from specifically these classical psychedelics?
Yeah, so my work right now is really focused on addiction. And that's because addiction probably, and I know we know that it has the highest treatment gap out of all mental health disorders. So less than 10% of patients with an addiction actually receive treatment. And of those, about 80% of them relapse. So really, about 2% of the entire population of people with addiction. So there's about 165 million people in the world. Um, Only about 4 million of them are actually receiving treatment. That's 160 million people that are just suffering and not being able to treat themselves. It's actually, deplorable that we haven't moved the needle on developing effective interventions or access to treatments in a generation. And so my job is twofold. So it's to, number one, investigate the brain mechanisms of addiction. And this has been an endeavor that's been done for over 40 to 50 years. But the idea that I'm trying to develop alongside colleagues is to really understand whether if we can understand how addiction works in the brain and gambling addiction, which is a behavioral model of addiction, so it allows us to see the brain in an addictive state that hasn't been influenced by drugs. So we really understand just how those core repetitive behaviors that are maladaptive, how the rewiring of those networks works. If we can image that and figure out what it is that might be going wrong, and we've figured that out. I did that in my PhD, is developing these tasks that could probe how the brain goes dysfunctional with responses to reward or cognitive processes. So we characterize what we call biomarkers and things in the brain that don't look so right or maladaptive compared to people that don't have a gambling addiction. So my key question over the next 2 years is, does psilocybin therapy restore or normalize or change these maladaptive brain networks that are central to gambling addiction? And if so, does that restoration lead to those being free from gambling addiction? We don't know those two questions because it's never been done in a behavioral addiction in the world before. So it's the first study which will look at, I guess, the clinical effects in a behavioral addiction and also the world's first longitudinal MRI study. So we'll be scanning people's brains 12 weeks after taking psilocybin and seeing whether those long-term brain network changes correlate with clinical outcome. So far, no one's ever done brain imaging that long after a psychedelic ever in the history of the world. So we hope to be, one of, the kind of deeply phenotyped brain imaging studies in a clinical population with psilocybin, and also hopefully unlock the development of new treatments for behavioral addictions. So gambling is the first one, but we now see a rise in internet addiction, we see social media addiction, porn addiction, food addiction, all these behavioral addictions, non-substance addictions. We're seeing an increased amount of people coming up to the clinic suffering. And that might be because of the society that we live in. Addiction is, I believe, a representation of an unstable world in which we live, and people are looking for stability in this unstable environment, and behaviors or drug use can provide that short-term relief that can lead in some people to addiction. So can we rehabituate these people into their world in a more adaptive way? And can psilocybin allow those brain networks that have been so engrossed over time over their addictive patterns, can we break them free and literally reconnect them with natural rewards and the world around them?
We shall see. There's just so much available, right? It's like our brains are still, I mean, the same they were for so long without having this access, right? Access to
Mhm.
so much dopamine and access to like this consistent way to stimulate ourselves. And it's like we're going crazy because we're completely overstimulated. And it is a really effective short-term maladaptive way to deal with the world is just re-stimulate, right? We all do it. We all do it with our phones. I was telling a friend the other day, I said, do you know anyone, and maybe there's some people, but not many, right? Who say, I have a very healthy relationship with my phone. Like I only look at it when I want. I never pick it up when I don't. And I'm like, not many, right? Like that takes active. I'm in like a group where that is like part of our, we like put a sticky note on our phone because most people pick up their phone over 200 times per day.
Yeah,
You
it's
think if you ask someone, they'd say, I don't know, 30, 40. No, sometimes it's like 300 times per day that you're checking. And so when you become cognitively aware of like, okay, now I have to write another tick on my thing. And like, was I actually going to do something specific or like it was just time to get the reward again? So that's really, really fascinating.
the whole digital desires sort of field is so omnipresent in our society, and I believe it's causing the decline of the human brain, of our evolutionary potential. Um, it's actually really shocking to see the impact it has on young adults. I think in the next 10 years, we're really going to see the negative consequences that digital interventions in media have had on Gen Z, like in their 20s, after their brains matured at the age of 25, are they going to look different to the people before their generations that didn't grow up with their phones during neurodevelopment? Probably. Is that going to cause really serious implications for humanity and the way that we coexist? I think so. It's a scary time. So our brains are really, dramatically evolving to increases in technology. Maybe in some cases for better, but I think probably maybe for worse. And so maybe drugs like psychedelics could reset those brains that have been so maladaptively rewired by technological advancements of the 21st century. And I guess that is sort of where some of my research is heading towards. But beyond that, one of the other key things that I'm really fascinated in is personalized therapy. And it's an area that's moving kind of in psychiatry, and it's about precision, and it's about making sure that everyone gets the right treatment as quick to them as they can based on who they are. And we've been successful in medical research at doing it in cancer patients and patients with Alzheimer's disease. So your brain and your mind are very fundamentally different to mine. Therefore, I may respond fundamentally different psilocybin to you. So if we can try to understand and what we call in science phenotype, which is bringing across loads of characteristics such as, we can do brain imaging, we can do behavioral tests, personality tests, psychological tests, and bring all of this multimodal data together, leverage this, technological advance that we have, and generate these models that might be predictive of what dose of psilocybin or what number of integration or what type of therapy. And that is really what I see the field moving to in 10 years, is what I'd like to call precision psychedelic therapy. So that is really what I hope some of my work will start moving towards. over the next decade, if I'm still around to do all of this work. So, crossed.
We hope that you are because you're doing such a fabulous job. And I'm just so happy to see, really in the last 10 years that I've been in this world, the meeting of what almost like socially, I guess, has been separated, right? With like science versus spirituality, right? Or like science versus religion. Or just growing up, I grew up in the Christian church, like this idea of like you either believed in evolution or creation. It was always like there was always like these, it's vastly different, it's completely separate. And of course that is not true. And is there anything, I guess, another question, the last one, this is what I'll leave you with, since you were in a group and since you had, not a full retreat experience, but the beginnings of retreat experience, right? A little bit of preparation, a little bit of, some somatic movement, getting to know the people around you. I know that you even had some kind of interactions with some of the men that were around you in the ceremony. Is there anything that you were going to bring back as far as, into the clinic that you see, maybe not right away, but that we could potentially bring as far as set and setting, to inspire, you know, the best results we possibly can from psilocybin in a clinical setting.
Yeah, one of the things I'm really deeply thinking about now is the power of the group and and the container in which it was delivered. Now, often like in the way that we've been doing it here at Imperial and other centers is it's an individual journey and individuals will go through it and they'll go out and live their lives and learn how to take on board the new tools that they've learned. Um, but really in the group, you're almost kind of having to put into practice straight away how to like be in this kind of community. And humans are by our very existence community-based mammals, and we have to thrive and survive in a community in order to be successful. And therefore, really learning as soon as you come out of that group experience, right? I need to talk to this person, and I need to hold space for this, and they can hold space for me, and learning like the kind of social dynamics of that, almost like in these vulnerable states that you're in, was powerful. And I think you're kind of learning in that hyperplastic state how to hold responsibility for others and be responsible for yourself and learn how to, navigate challenging interpersonal conflicts whilst at the same time dealing with other people. And really, that group situation, I think, really may hold a place in the future of even things like addiction medicine. Because if you look at things like the AA and Narcotics Anonymous, they have weekly meetings in groups and sponsors, and they rely on these group-based sort of care models, community care models. So I wonder now how we can bring in more group-related practices into psychedelics, specifically for addiction, and even maybe in the future for patients that I'm working with in the gambling addiction space, like how can we bring a more group element in? So that was really one of the key things that this experience that you offered has really struck home with. And one of the other things is to what degree can we bring some more other element to the setting and the ceremonial setting in? Now, spirituality is a really tricky one in medicine because it's not really clear what that means yet. And actually, today I finished my integration. I know it took a bit of time. And one of your final bits of the podcast is Lisa Miller's a podcast from her on the Awakened Brain. And she's the director of the Center for Spirituality and Science. And I listened to her podcast literally this morning and listened to some of the stats on like, people that have a spiritual practice are 80% less likely to develop depression, 60% less likely to develop substance use problems, 90% more likely, I think it was, to like be able to have like effective well-being. And brain imaging scans showed that they had greater white matter integrity in the neocortex and more like stronger parts of the brain. And it was just fascinating that science and spirituality has come together through her. But in clinical medicine, how can we is there a role for spirituality in the healing journeys in clinical Western medicine? That is the big question. AA fundamentally, Alcoholics Anonymous has a spiritual element to it, and that's proven to be very effective. Psychedelics are what I call biopsychosocial and spiritual interventions. They work on all of those four different kind of areas. But the spiritual aspect is not really something that psychiatry has sat down well with, or psychopharmacologists. And I guess it's an open question. I'm open to exploring it, um, because I think it's played a role in my own journey in the last month, is opening up to spirituality a bit more.
Yeah, we'll have to see. I think just even, being open and letting people like express in the ways that they want to express their journey. And we do this in ours, right? There's no dogma. If you want to say God, if you want to say subconscious, if you want to say the universe, if you want to say, my brain, like that all depends on you. And I really love the way that Sam Harris has, over time moved from his, like, I guess you could say, like, staunch atheism into a more like spiritual path. And he just says like the human spirit. You're right.
Hmm.
Like, it doesn't have to be a belief or a system or a book to be spiritual. It's just like, I'm just going to connect with my human spirit, like, however I define that, whether that's what happens when I close my eyes and I just breathe, right? Like, things start to move, and whether that's a prayer to nothing, to my own self, to myself tomorrow, right? I'm going to pray to myself tomorrow that I really want to have a good day and eat well so that I feel good in the morning, right? That, like, I feel like spirituality can be so openly defined as just almost like time that you take for yourself to do any sort of like exploratory work. It doesn't have to have
Religious element.
or a religion or a history even, really. And it's so fun to watch people at the retreats like get to explore what that word means. But maybe it doesn't mean anything, right? Maybe it is like I'm going in and I'm rewiring aspects of my, of a part of my brain. Great.
Yeah.
Fantastic. That's if that's what it means. But we also encourage people, right, just like you would when you go see a movie, like suspend your disbelief, like pretend that you're on a alien planet, right? Just pretend and see what happens. Because when you're open, like I had mentioned, that's always my intention now with the mushrooms is show me what I need right now. Like this night, not tomorrow, not next year, but like what do I need tonight? What do I need to explore or let go of or learn? And with that openness, instead of like the rigid, like I need to do this and I have to change that about myself and my personality, when we go into psychedelics with that, just that open of like, here I am right now in this particular moment in time in my cellular system, what needs to happen right now?
Yeah.
I'm open to it. So yeah, thank you so much. Oh my gosh, this has been fantastic. You are
Yeah.
wonderful. I'm so excited to see where your research takes you, where your personal experiences weave into the questions that you continue to ask and the research that you continue to do and all the people that you're going to help. Like you said, so many of us, right? Like moving through addiction in such a way that we're not able to like fully live this human life. And you are doing direct, immediate research and things that are going to help people with that. So I can't wait to see you in the next 5 to 10 years. Again, if we're still here, if the planet still exists, if America's still a country, who
Yeah.
knows?
If we get the funding to carry on, but hopefully the world is moving towards a greater acceptance. So yeah, I hope to be finishing off what we've started, and yeah, hopefully we'll see you soon, maybe. Psychedelic science, that is definitely,
Science. I have a lot of ideas that I'm going to reach out to you about, and we're going to get some of your. I know that you had mentioned you're like we're really thinking about some of the professors, some of the people that you work with, and you're like, oh my gosh, they have to experience this, and I was like, mm-hmm.
yes, yes, for
So,
sure.
all right, Dr. Rayyan, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure. Can't wait to see where our work goes into the future. And you have
Yes.
a fabulous evening listening to your body and doing whatever it tells you that it wants to do.
I will do. Thank you so much again. And, again, I just want to say I'm so grateful for the experience that I had to you and to facilitators and everyone else in the group because, yeah, it was really, truly a very special moment in my life for me.
Hmm.